Did you know that the Beatles were undocumented? Or that they used many other names before? They had to pay to make their first recording. Find out about all this and more in the rock story of the Beatles. RockStory. Three of the Beatles we know met at London College Art. They were able to study here thanks to an educational policy of the British government that, through an exam, evaluated the boys when they reached certain ages, and it gave access to education to those who proved to have skills and couldn't afford it. All the Beatles came from working-class families. It was in 1956 that John Lennon formed the Quarrymen, a musical group inspired by a genre called skiffle. It is a type of music that was played with everyday objects, in addition to the occasional real instrument. It was a fashion in England at the time. Around 9 members passed through the Quarrymen, including 3 of the members of the London quartet that became famous as the Beatles. It was Buddy Holly who influenced Lennon first, since he was the most prominent in a skiffle, although they also helped to light his creative fuse Elvis, the Beach Boys, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and even Bob Dylan, who rather belongs to the indie genre. The following year, at the St. Peter Parish in the suburb of Bolton, they met John Winston Lennon 17 and James Paul McCartney 15 during a presentation that the Quarrymen did there. For that first meeting of the 2 most prominent artists of the contemporary pop music, 1957 has been called the Year Zero, when a whole change in the way of making music began, affecting the way of recording any type of music. John had already dropped out of school because he failed. It was then that he began dating Cynthia Powell, a classmate from the same school with whom he would somehow have to see the rest of his life. Already a member of the Quarrymen, Paul met 14-year-old George Harrison on the bus that took them to school, and there he invited him to join the band. Until that moment, there was no recording of what they played, but in 1958, together, they raised the money to record their first album, just one piece. And since they couldn't afford the tape recording, they had to record directly onto the acetate in one take. On the A side was That'll Be the Day by his idol Buddy Holly, and on B, In Spite of All Danger, one of McCartney's first songs. They decided to take turns so that each one could have the album for a week. If you're interested in listening to the songs we are talking about, click on the recommendations that are here top right or on the information icon and let the playlist unfold. Then click on the song you want to listen to, and when finished, click on the return button to continue watching this video. This is a view of how you will see it on your computer desktop, and this is other one about you will see it on your phone. 3 days after such a significant recording, a bus accidentally ran over Mrs. Julia, the John's mother, in front of the house where he lived with his uncles. The lady died right there. In 1959, one of the members of the Quarrymen decided to leave the band, and this almost made it disappear. However, they managed to turn Colin Hendon's departure into an opportunity to reinvent themselves. They started trying new names. It's believed that they played with certain words, based first on the name of the skiffle group that John loved so much, Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Crickets, and hence Beatles. The thing was to use the name of an insect to emulate his favorite band. And then, in the meaning of one of the syllables of the word beetle, beat, rhythm. This term had already been adopted to name a type of music that was in fashion, Mersey beat. There are versions that suggest that it was John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe who created the name The Beatles. 1960 was the year in which the most influential musical group of all time was defined. They were also the first artists to openly participate in politics, and they paid the consequences. But you have to admit that they weren't geniuses from the beginning. Just listen to that first recording for which they paid, or some others from when they started. To have to admit it, they were not born knowing. But they learned, and they did it very quickly, to the degree of becoming an icon of the counterculture of the mid-1960s. Together they recorded 219 songs, of which 46 were in the top 40, and with which they raised $1,500 million at that time only in the sale of records. But let's focus on 1960 because in addition to defining the Beatles, who are now a legend, other important events also occurred on this rock story. Paul and George finished school, for example, and that allowed them to dedicate themselves full-time to looking for opportunities. They began to perform in modest nightclubs in Liverpool and even made some home recordings like Paul's Cayenne. It's only music without voices, the shortest of all his compositions. They used a Grundig tape recorder that a friend lent them and recorded at McCartney's house. Alan Williams, their first manager, helped them by getting them some gigs in bars and slums in Hamburg, Germany, even though they weren't very satisfied with the quality of the band. The guys had a hard time convincing their families that going to Germany was a good idea, but the £100 that they would pay them a week helped a lot. In Hamburg, the boys did not work in good places. They played among drunks, gangsters, transvestites and prostitutes. That's where his various addictions began and the debauchery that became his lifestyle. Alan Williams himself was sure that they frequently suffered from venereal diseases because of their promiscuous sexual habits. Johnny Barrow, a press agent for the Beatles, claimed that John Lennon, for example, was a sexual adventurer who rejected nothing. He could try anything. Royston Ellis, a poet and friend of the group, has said that John was bisexual and willing to experiment, and that he said it from personal experience. It was he who gave them a drug try for the first time. Johnny Sheridan, a musician who lived with the Beatles in Hamburg at that time, once said that he thought Paul was homosexual and that they went together to steal underwear and socks because they didn't have much money. With him they recorded some songs for an album by that artist, among them Cry for Shadow, which was published in Germany the following year. Horst Fascher, manager of one of the clubs where they worked during their stay in Germany, said he saw John in a private with a transvestite. When the Beatles traveled to Germany, they did not have permission to work, so they came in as students. But at almost 2 years old, George was deported because authorities discovered that he was undocumented and that he was a minor. Later, Pete and Paul were expelled after causing an outbreak of fire for having set fire to a condom. Upon their return from Hamburg, they again tried to position themselves in the bars and nightclubs of Liverpool. A former schoolmate, Bill Harry, who had a modest music magazine called Mercy Beat, wrote about them constantly and on one occasion put a picture of them on the front page. That was the way Brian Epstein, the manager of the most important record store in town, got interested in them. In 1961 they began to play at the Cavern, the place where they met Epstein. Stuart Sutcliffe decided to stay in Germany to dedicate himself permanently to painting and marry Astrid Kircher. She was also a plastic artist and who suggested that her style so characteristic of the Beatles called mop top, and that was part of the image that Brian Epstein designed to make them known internationally. At that point, Paul gave up the guitar to pick up the bass that Sutcliffe put down.